We tend to call them the first civilization, and the title is earned. The Sumerians invented writing, the city, the wheel, the law code, the very idea of dividing an hour into 60 minutes. The entire operating system of the modern world traces back to one people in southern Mesopotamia, and yet we cannot say with any confidence where they came from, and they vanished as a distinct people while their inventions outlived them by 5,000 years. That is the problem at the center of this story. A civilization this foundational should have left a clear ancestral trail behind it. It did not. I came across the Sumerian origin question while researching something else entirely, and I could not let it go, because their language refuses to connect to any other language on Earth. Recent ancient DNA work has finally entered the record. What it revealed was not what anyone expected. Start with the land, because the land is the first thing that makes the story refuse to make sense. Southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and the Euphrates run down into the Persian Gulf, is a country of clay and reeds. There are no forests. There is almost no stone. There is no metal in the ground worth speaking of. And the two rivers that define the place do not behave the way the Nile behaves. They flood without warning. They change course without warning. And when they move, they turn whole inhabited regions into uninhabitable swamp. This was, by almost any measure, the worst possible place to build the first great civilization. And it is exactly where the Sumerians built it. How they came to be there at all is one of the genuine, unsolved questions of human history. The first clue did not come from a tomb or a monument. It came from their language. Sumerian is what linguists call an isolate. It is related to nothing. No parent, no surviving cousins, no known connection to any other tongue spoken anywhere on the planet, then or now. And the strangeness goes deeper than that. The names of the great Sumerian cities, places like Nippur and Lagash, are not Sumerian words. The names of the rivers and the lakes were borrowed from somewhere else. Even the core vocabulary of farming, the words for plow, for farmer, for the act of sowing seed, came from an earlier language that was already there. There were settlements at these sites before the Sumerians ever arrived to claim them. So, where did they come from? The theories have never stopped multiplying. Some scholars argue they were native all along, the direct descendants of the older Ubad and Uruk cultures that built the first irrigation and the first temples. The Sumerians themselves told a different story. According to their own myths, they came by sea from a paradise island called Dilmun, the place we now call Bahrain. Traces of them really were found there, but they appear in Mesopotamia far too early for that account to hold. Others have placed their homeland in the Indus Valley, in Anatolia, in the Caucasus, in Arabia, even in Tibet. Every one of these theories has a hole in it. The trail goes cold in every direction at once, and the one thing that might finally settle the question was not written on any tablet. It was buried in the bones. Before we ask what happened to these people, it is worth understanding exactly what was lost, because the scale of it is staggering. Somewhere around the turn of the 4th millennium into the 3rd, something extraordinary happened in that landscape of mud and reeds. Ordinary settlements began to swell into the world's first true cities. The mechanism behind it was water. To master the unpredictable rivers, the Sumerians built a vast network of canals, dikes, and reservoirs, and a city's power scaled directly with the size and efficiency of its irrigation system. That single fact reshaped human society. A surplus of food meant that not everyone had to farm, and so, for the first time, the world had artisans, merchants, priests, and scribes. The people who organized the water rose above the rest and became the first ruling elite. Then came the inventions, and the list is almost difficult to believe. They built the plow, which made farming efficient enough to free still more hands for other work. They built the wheel, used first to carry the statues of gods in ritual, and later mounted onto the first war chariots, pulled not by horses but by donkeys. They built with arches and columns when no one else on earth had thought to. Their ziggurats, vast stepped temple towers, climbed toward the sky. Their minds reached just as far. They invented a counting system based on the number 60, and you are still living inside it. It is why an hour has 60 minutes, why a day has 24 hours, why a circle has 360 degrees. They could solve quadratic equations. They understood the relationship between the sides of a right triangle more than 1,000 years before a Greek named Pythagoras was given the credit for it. They compiled the first catalogs of the stars, tracked the planets, and learned to predict eclipses of the sun and the moon. They divided time into a 7-day week and named each day for a body in the sky, a habit we have never abandoned. They wrote down the earliest law codes, centuries before Hammurabi, and in their quieter hours they brewed beer so thick they drank it through straws, and they worshipped a goddess of brewing while they did it. Here is what makes all of this so strange. A people who engineered the foundations of the modern world should be the easiest civilization in history to trace. Instead, they are the hardest. Of everything the Sumerians built, one invention matters more than the rest, both for them and for us, and it is the one that should have solved the mystery. The development of writing was slow, unfolding across thousands of years, and it began with something utterly mundane. Once people produced surplus food and began trading it, they needed a way to keep records. So across the ancient Near East, they used small clay tokens, 1 token standing for 1 sheep, 10 tokens for 10 sheep, a simple system of accounting. Then, around 3,300 years before the Common Era, officials in the city of Uruk had a brilliant idea. Instead of storing the tokens, why not press them into soft clay and record the information directly? That small change lit the fuse. From there it accelerated. People began scratching simple pictures into the clay, a sheep, a loaf, a person, each sign standing for a thing. Then came the decisive leap. The Sumerians realized that a symbol could represent a sound rather than an object. The sign for the word arrow could now be used anywhere that same sound appeared, regardless of meaning, and suddenly a writing system could capture the full complexity of spoken language, grammar, and tone and all. Scribes pressed a reed stylus into wet clay at an angle, leaving wedge-shaped marks, which is why we call the script cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge. And it did not stay confined to Sumer. It was adopted by the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Elamites, the Hittites. It became the operating system of the entire ancient Near East. Now here is the forensic turn. Clay, as it happens, is almost immortal. More than 1 million cuneiform tablets have survived into the present day, and archaeologists are still pulling new ones out of the ground. Because of them, we know these people in extraordinary detail. We know their trade deals and their lawsuits, their myths and their love poems, the contents of their storerooms, and the names of their gods. And that is exactly what makes them so maddening. We can read their grocery lists. We can read their poetry. We cannot read their ancestry. They are, in a real sense, the best documented mystery in the ancient world, a people who wrote down almost everything except the one thing we most want to know, which is who they actually were. To answer that, you cannot read the tablets. You have to read the genome. Reading the genome of the Sumerians is harder than it sounds, and for a long time it was simply impossible. Ancient DNA is fragile, and the climate of Mesopotamia is close to the worst environment on Earth for preserving it. Heat and humidity break the molecule down until nothing usable is left. So for decades, there was a strange silence at the center of the field. The tablets talked endlessly, the bones said nothing. Then recent ancient DNA work on remains from across the Near East finally pulled a genuine signal out of the noise, and what it showed quietly rearranged the whole story. The expectation, built up over a century of theorizing, was that the Sumerians would turn out to be a single, distinct population, a people who swept in from somewhere else and replaced whoever had been there before. That is what the mysterious arrivals from Dilmun, from the Indus, from the Caucasus had always implied. The genetic picture is nothing like that. What the DNA reveals is a fusion. The Sumerians carried the ancestry of the local Mesopotamian farmers, the descendants of the older Ubaid and Uruk cultures, blended with movement out of the neighboring regions, the highlands of the Zagros to the east, populations to the north, the lands of the Levant. And that single finding reaches back and explains every loose thread we left hanging. It explains why the cities already had names when the Sumerians arrived. It explains why the words for plow and farmer were borrowed from an older tongue. It explains why settlements sat on those sites before any Sumerian did. The Sumerians were not strangers who landed on an empty shore. They were what happened when several streams of people met in the same river valley and merged into something new. The question we had been asking all along, where did they come from, was the wrong question. The answer was never a place. It was a process. The language remains its own stubborn puzzle, because a tongue can outlive the ancestry of the people who first spoke it, and the isolate is not fully resolved by any of this. And it is worth being honest about the limits. The samples are still few, the bones still scarce, the conclusions still provisional. But the shape of the answer has changed. If the Sumerians did not arrive from nowhere, then their vanishing demands an explanation too. A people assembled from many streams does not simply disappear. So, where did they go? The disappearance did not begin with a catastrophe. It began with a neighbor. For centuries, the Sumerians shared Mesopotamia with the Akkadians, a Semitic-speaking people who had settled mostly to the north, and over time the two cultures bled into one another in everything from religion to government. They were already merging long before anyone forced the issue. Then someone forced the issue. In the late 24th century before the Common Era, a man named Sargon rose to power. The story of his beginning is half legend, the tale of a baby placed in a reed basket and set adrift on the river, found and raised by a gardener. The history is firmer. He overthrew the king of Kish, seized power, and launched a campaign that pulled the squabbling Sumerian city-states under a single crown for the first time. His empire stretched from the Persian Gulf toward the Mediterranean, the first true empire the world had seen. He installed governors and stationed garrisons across conquered land, destroyed the kingdom of Abira, and captured the Elamite capital of Susa. His grandson, Naram-Sin, pushed further still, took the title, King of the Four Corners of the World, and declared himself a living god. That golden age was brief. The blow came from the east, from the Gutians, a tribal people out of the Zagros Mountains who began raiding the cities and around 2200 took the sacred city of Nippur. What followed is often called Mesopotamia's first dark age. The Gutians were mountain people with no understanding of the delicate irrigation that kept the river valley alive. The canals failed. Agriculture collapsed. Cities emptied. Only in the remote southern marshes, hard to reach and easy to ignore, did the old Sumerian way of life carry on more or less undisturbed. And here's the thing worth noticing. Everything happening on the surface, the conquest, the intermarriage, the slow absorption of one people into another, was the same process the genome had already recorded, only now playing out on the page of recorded history. The fusion that made the Sumerians was still running. They were not being wiped out and replaced by some foreign population. They were dissolving into the very peoples the DNA shows they were already partly made of. The boundary between Sumerian and Akkadian was thinning year by year. The Gutians were eventually driven out, and the south would rise one final time. But the direction of the story was already set. That final rise was real, and for a moment it looked like a true revival. After the Gutians were driven out, leadership passed to a king named Ur-Nammu, the founder of what we now call the Third Dynasty of Ur. He reunified Sumer and Akkad under one rule and set about rebuilding everything that had broken. He raised the great ziggurat of Ur, a vast stepped temple to the moon god, whose ruins still rise above the southern Iraqi plain today. He restored the canals and reservoirs that the Gutians had let rot. He built a centralized bureaucracy, organized the provinces, and ran them on a rotating tax system in which each province supplied the treasury for a single month of the year. The famous Sumerian king list was compiled in this period, a political document meant to bind the new dynasty to ancient and even mythical kings. But one detail gives the whole revival away. The rulers deliberately restored Sumerian as the official language of administration and religion, even though Akkadian was already the language people actually spoke in the street. You do not have to restore a living thing. The language was becoming a relic, kept alive on purpose because it was no longer alive on its own. Then the slow death set in. Centuries of over-irrigation had poisoned the soil with salt, crop yields fell, and farmland was abandoned across the south. The Amorites pressed in from the west, and the Elamites from the east, and in the year 2004 BCE, the Elamites stormed and sacked the city of Ur itself. The Sumerians recorded their own grief in a poem we call the Lament of Ur, in which the gods themselves abandon the city and leave it to ruin. And here is where the story turns. The Sumerians vanished as a distinct people, but this was not extinction. Their language survived as a sacred and scholarly tongue, studied and copied for nearly 2,000 more years, much as Latin lingered in medieval Europe. Their religion, their literature, their mathematics, and their law were absorbed whole by the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, and carried forward into every civilization that followed. And the genetic thread, the fusion the DNA had captured, did not break either. The people did not die out. They merged into the populations of Mesopotamia and were carried inside the ancestry of the entire region. The empire ended. The inheritance did not. Here is the thing that stays with me after weeks inside this material. The story of the Sumerians is almost always told as a mystery of origins, a people who came from nowhere and vanished into nothing, leaving only their inventions behind. The DNA tells a different story. It tells of a people who were never a single migrating tribe at all, but a fusion of several, which is exactly why the question of where they came from never had a clean answer. It tells of a civilization that did not so much die as dissolve into its neighbors, its conquerors, and its heirs. And it tells of something else, a genetic and cultural thread running out of those river valleys, through every empire that followed, and down into the foundations of the world you are living in right now. The Sumerians vanished as a people. The thread they started never broke.